In 1966, the Beatles grew tired of touring. When their fans were so loud that no one could hear the music, John Lennon said they could send out 4 waxworks and that would satisfy the crowds. Beatles concerts are nothing to do with the music anymore. They're just bloody tribal rites. People went to see the shaking mop tops and the Cuban-heeled boots, rather than the music the Beatles were passionate about creating. On top of that, their lives had been threatened in Japan, the Philippines, and the United States in a single year. The only way they could stay together was if they stopped touring completely. They took a 3-month break. John went to Spain to make How I Won the War. Ringo spent time with his family. George went to India to study sitar with Ravi Shankar. And Paul went on holiday to Kenya with their road manager, Mal Evans. On the plane home, he came up with an idea. What if, for their next album, they weren't the Beatles? They would be free to experiment and sound however they wanted if they made their next album as alter egos. There would be an Edwardian military band. A band that would go on to sell over 30 million copies, more than any other Beatles album. That album was Sgt Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Nearly 10 years later, Robert Stigwood, one of the most powerful and successful producers in nearly every area of show business, brought together an all-star cast to recreate the magic of the Beatles' music, the disco generation. The result was a cinematic disaster that frantically swerved between bizarre and tedious. So, why did it seem like such a good idea? And why did it fail so spectacularly? In this video, I will examine why this movie seemed like such a great idea, and why it failed to replicate the success of producer Robert Stigwood's previous rock opera films. The idea of a Beatles jukebox musical is nothing new. Whilst the Beatles' first 2 films had songs that were mostly new to the album, they really had nothing to do with the context of the film. In other words, these aren't songs about what their characters are feeling, but are just the Beatles practicing, performing, or recording. Even though the title songs are relevant thematically, they're never sung in character. The lads don't break into a hard day's night as they bemoan their frantic schedule, nor do they burst into help as they are being pursued by the antagonists. However, the Beatles cartoon TV series did clumsily create short stories around the songs. Being chased by a jealous boyfriend? Let's sing She Loves You. A vampire lady wants to marry you? Let's sing Babies in Black. We've been abandoned by an alien lady on a distant planet who took us on a day trip with a one-way ticket? Let's sing Day Tripper. The team who made those cartoons are somehow the same team behind Yellow Submarine, which is, as far as I know, the first proper jukebox musical based on the Beatles. Whilst the film does include 4 original songs, the rest are from previous albums, and the film's psychedelic sequences, characters and plot devices are all constructed around the songs. While songs like Only a Northern Song and Eleanor Rigby are just for establishing the mood, and their lyrics aren't relevant to the story, others establish characters, such as a man who literally lives in nowhere, or are sung in response to a situation, such as singing When I'm 64 when they become old men in the sea of time, or singing All You Need Is Love as a rebellion against the order of the Blue Meanies' reign of misery. Basically, while some songs were merely the backdrop for some stunning animation that was as experimental as the Beatles themselves, others fit the plot pretty well. It would be another 6 years until anyone would attempt another Beatles jukebox musical, with the 1974 off-Broadway musical Sgt Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band on the Road, produced by Robert Stigwood. The late Robert Stigwood was once one of the most powerful producers of music, stage and screen. Although he would go on to produce Hair, Jesus Christ Superstar, Evita, Saturday Night Fever and Grease, he started out in the 60s as the manager of bands such as Cream and the Bee Gees. Whilst he worked with Beatles manager Brian Epstein, going so far as to merge companies with him, the Beatles refused to work with Stigwood multiple times. leading to his departure soon after Epstein's death. Stigwood's first film, the 1973 screen adaptation of Jesus Christ Superstar, was a huge hit, leading him to adapt another rock opera, The Who's Tommy, in 1975. Although a lot of people I've seen talking about the Sgt Pepper movie bring up Saturday Night Fever because it was Stigwood's big disco hit featuring the music of the Bee Gees, I think more direct comparisons can be made with Tommy. Based on what is considered to be the first rock opera, Tommy's film adaptation had no dialogue and an all-star cast, many of whom were only around for a single song. Most of these stars were contemporary musicians, such as Eric Clapton, Arthur Brown, Elton John and Tina Turner, as well as actors such as Jack Nicholson and Paul Nicholas. The cast was heavily utilised in the marketing and it paid off, making nearly 10 times its budget at the box office. As I said before, the Bee Gees were managed by Stigwood for over 10 years at that point, but they had just reached superstardom when they recorded the soundtrack for Stigwood's film Saturday Night Fever, smashing chart records that had been set by the Beatles a decade earlier. They had also covered 3 Beatles songs for the soundtrack of All This and World War II, a documentary that combined Beatles covers by 1976's biggest artists with World War II footage. The soundtrack did pretty well, despite the film's failure. Peter Frampton just had the best-selling live album of all time, and Steve Martin's comedy album, Wild and Crazy Guy, reached number 2 in the Billboard album charts. That's not the comedy charts, that's the regular charts. So, Robert Stigwood had the music of 2 of the most successful albums from one of the most successful bands of all time. The band that broke the records of that band, the artist with the best-selling live album of all time, and a comedian whose show was listened to by millions of people across the US, in a film that would replicate the formula of 2 box office smashes. What could possibly go wrong? Again, this film was loosely inspired by an off-Broadway musical, but the film was written by Henry Edwards. He had never written a screenplay before, but Stigwood hired him because he was impressed by the musical analysis he'd written for the New York Times. Even if I hadn't seen the results, I'd still say that was a terrible idea. That's like asking a film critic to write a rock opera. Just because you're a critic of something doesn't mean that you can create art, let alone art in a medium that you haven't studied. It certainly looks like Edwards would struggle to create a story on its own, let alone one written as an excuse for songs and celebrity guests to be crowbarred in. The story follows Billy Shears, played by Peter Frampton, the grandson of the legendary Sgt Pepper, whose band was the most powerful weapon in the First World War. Around 20 years after Pepper's death, Billy revives the band with his best friends, the Henderson brothers, who I will just refer to as the Bee Gees because you will never remember their names, with Billy's jealous brother Dougie as their manager. They get taken to Hollywood and get seduced by record producer B.D. and his girl band, Lucy and the Diamonds, into signing themselves away. Meanwhile, mean Mr. Mustard is instructed by the mysterious FVB to steal the magical Sgt Pepper instruments from the band's hometown of Heartland because they hate love and love money. When the town becomes seedy as a result, Billy's girlfriend, Strawberry Fields, goes to Hollywood to get the band to find the instruments and save the town. They take them from the FVB's henchmen, a plastic surgeon and a brainwasher preparing the FVB's followers, before they go home to hold a benefit concert for Heartland. During the concert, Dougie and Lucy steal the money while Strawberry is captured by Mustard, because he's infatuated with her. The band chase them to the lair of the FVB, or Future Villain Band, who are indoctrinating Strawberry along with their legions of followers. Billy kills the FVB's frontman, but Strawberry also falls to her death. As a mourning Billy attempts to jump to his death, A magical weather vane turns into Billy Preston and saves him, brings Strawberry back to life, and turns the bad guys into members of the clergy. The end. If the plot synopsis seemed like a mess, believe me, it's nothing compared to the execution. It's pretty hard to understate how all over the place the screenplay is. The villains in this film are Mean Mr. Mustard with Brute and his fembots, Dougie Shears, BD, Lucy and the Diamonds, Dr. Maxwell, Alice Cooper, and the future villain band. Obviously, that's way too many! Jesus Christ Superstar had a small cast of villains from the Bible itself, but they were connected and easy to keep track of. The corrupt religious leaders, the politician, and the traitor. The main villain of Tommy is Oliver Reed's Uncle Frank, who is more of a corrupt and antagonistic presence than in the original album. Uncle Ernie's in the background and assists with Frank's commercialisation of Tommy's religion in the second half of the film. Tommy has a few cameo villains, but it's always clear who the main antagonists are. Tommy is finally brought down by his own followers, who are incited by their own frustration at Frank and Ernie's commercialisation of Tommy's beliefs. Whilst both of these films have multiple villains, it is clear how they are all connected, and it is clear who the main villain is that allows the audience to focus on them. Whilst the Blue Meanies also had cartoonishly simple motivations, it was also a lot clearer. The sheer number of Sgt Pepper's villains prevents us from keeping track of them. The fantastical elements make little sense too. Sgt Pepper's instruments have the power to make dreams come true, which is why they are stolen. However, we never actually see them make dreams come true once in this movie. Considering this is actually set up, maybe that would be a better way of bringing back Strawberry Fields at the end rather than the weather vane that is just supposed to point towards happiness. Furthermore, it would give Billy and the band something to actually do to change the course of their destiny, aside from getting into fights with Muppet hosts to collect McGuffins that have no impact on the plot whatsoever. When the instruments are gone, Heartland is broken, seedy and full of pinball machines for some reason, like some Sesame Street version of Back to the Future 2. Admittedly, there is a similar plot point in Yellow Submarine, but it made sense. The Beatles bring back music and joy to Pepperland after the Blue Meanies take it away. This is represented visually as colour and movement returns to the Pepperland and its citizens. I'm not saying that everything needs to be explained when it comes to more fantastical elements, but it still needs to make some kind of sense to the viewer. You can't clumsily exposit the abilities of these magical objects through narration and then have them do something completely different. The reason Jesus Christ Superstar and Tommy worked without dialogue is that its songs were written with the purpose of telling that exact story. In fact, Tommy had several original songs and even altered lyrics from the original album to clarify the story further. 2 whole songs are literally narration from an unseen narrator. Although the 90s stage adaptation didn't include these extra songs or lyrics, it is written as a musical and has dialogue between the songs. The film also successfully used visuals to tell the story. Once he is deaf, dumb and blind, he suffers from 3 traumas. After each of these sequences, Tommy sees a reflection of himself in the colour of each scene: red, yellow and blue. These finally come together as one white reflection that leads him to the pinball machine that becomes his claim to fame. This makes these scenes feel like more than just episodes in his life, as we metaphorically see how they lead him to the escape of pinball. This also helps to make Tommy less passive as a protagonist after watching several episodes of bad things happening to him that he cannot stop in any way. We don't need a narrator to explain this to us. The strength of the symbolism and visual storytelling do this for us. There are several songs in the Sgt Pepper movie that do make sense in the narrative, at least in theory. Strawberry singing Here Comes the Sun to Billy is suitable not just because she is waking up her lover, but when she sings It's Alright, she sings it with a hint of doubt. Me and Mr. Mustard is a song describing a horrid, dirty old man, so making this an I Am song describing the villain is a great idea. Golden Slumbers works perfectly as a fond farewell to a dead lover, as does The Long and Winding Road. Sgt Pepper's works as an introduction to the returning band, with the subsequent, with a little help from my friends, being an opportunity to establish the band's fraternal bond. She's Leaving Home just needs reenacting. You Never Give Me Your Money works as a duet between a gold digger and her thieving boyfriend. Being for the benefit of Mr. Kite mostly works as the introduction to a charity event. Including When I'm 64 as a creepy old man singing to the damsel in distress works despite the change in context. After all, that song was written as a satire of idealised northern domesticity. It's believable that this character would still have this old-fashioned idea of having a woman to knit sweaters for him. I Want You does work as both a song of lust and as a song of greed, and those are really the only songs that properly work conceptually. The lyrics still don't always match, but they mostly work. Maxwell Silverhammer, a chirpy song about a serial killer, is sung by Steve Martin. In the movie, Martin plays an evil plastic surgeon who makes evil people look younger so that they can be brainwashed by Alice Cooper. The character is supposedly singing his backstory, but the kind of calculating, greedy person who would give plastic surgery to the corrupt seems completely different from the kind of wild and crazy guy who would kill people over mild annoyances. I'm Fixing a Hole just starts out of nowhere. The mayor just starts singing it as a soft shoe number after the band leaves. If they just left it as a cutaway gag with a fantasy bit, it would be fine, but it just keeps going and overstays its welcome. Why is it here? It adds nothing to the plot and it establishes nothing about the character, like many songs in this film. Strawberry Fields, singing Strawberry Fields to Billy, also makes no sense. It's not just because it was originally written about a place. If it was the drug-addled and delusional Billy singing this about strawberry, then that would work far better. I think maybe the writer included songs that he remembered from the Sgt Pepper and Abbey Road albums without actually going through the lyrics to see if it made sense, especially those of the verses. For example, the chorus of Come Together works as a cult leader drawing in his followers. However, the verses describing someone cool in third person don't fit. Maybe if it were the chorus of brainwashed scouts singing that about the head of the future villain band, it would have worked. But all of the lyrics are being sung by Steven Tyler. The same happens with Get Back, as the verses are narrating irrelevant stories. The Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds sequence is just Lucy in the Diamonds singing a song on the billboard in Strawberry's imagination. It feels like the writer went, here's Lucy, here's the diamonds, and now they are in the sky. It would make far more sense if Billy and the band were singing it whilst they were high and being seduced by the girls, which would also explain the psychedelic lyrics. However, the writer never seemed to take this into consideration. Furthermore, none of the songs, with the exception of When I'm 64 and maybe I Want You, feel clever with their inclusion. But Across the Universe was bold enough to use some Beatles songs in a new and inventive way that fitted the story that they were trying to tell. They weren't written with these contexts in mind, but they still worked. Famously, the Beatles producer George Martin produced the soundtrack out of the fear that someone else would fail to respect the songs. The result is a mix of Beatles covers with a slight disco flair, replacing the Beatles' innovative studio sound of their later career. On the whole, the result is just okay. Inferior to the originals and lacking ambition, but mostly perfectly listenable. The best is certainly Aerosmith's cover of Come Together. Mustard's robots sound terrible in both of the songs they are in. The two weakest songs are probably Steve Martin's Maxwell Silverhammer and Alice Cooper's Because. I did like Because at first, but that's probably because it reminds me of better Alice Cooper songs like Devil's Food and I Love the Dead. I do like Steve Martin, including some of his wackier stuff, but it's all too much here. Yes, this foreshadows his role as another sadistic medical professional in Little Shop of Horrors, but he actually sings in that one instead of comic warbling.
He gets annoyed, wishing to avoid an unpleasant scene.
Whilst Who frontman Roger Daltrey played the title character in Tommy, reprising a role he had played in concert for years, he's either a child or blind, deaf and dumb for over half the film, so the character of Tommy's mother, played by established actress Anne Margaret who made her name in the movie musicals of the 60s, is who we follow for most of the film. Her performance in Tommy got her nominated for Best Actress at the Oscars that year, and she took home the Golden Globe for Best Actress in a Musical in Comedy. And that's a film that includes this scene. Whilst the film isn't carried by her entirely, it's Mrs. Walker and the relationship between her and Tommy that emotionally anchors this fantastical story. Roger Daltrey's debut performance as Tommy is good, especially when Tommy is blind, deaf and dumb. They essentially got lucky when they happened to cast a rock star with some raw acting ability. Oliver Reed is convincing as Tommy's corrupt and menacing stepfather, even though his singing falls short. Despite being a great actor, his voice is probably the weakest part of the film. Sgt Pepper is headed up by Peter Frampton, the Bee Gees and Sandy Farina. None of them become breakout actors like Elvis, Ringo or Roger Daltrey before them. In fact, even the most basic emotions seem alien to their characters. They try to look amazed by grinning and making their eyes really wide, and it looks really weird. One of the rumours going around is that their acting was so bad that they came up with the no dialogue idea. The Wall ran into this problem 3 years later when they realised that Roger Waters couldn't act. Instead of forcing him into something that he clearly couldn't do, they replaced him with Bob Geldof, a rock star that could act, even throwing away filmed footage in the process. If the celebrity cameos are too hammy or too wooden, it doesn't matter, because they are out of the film soon enough. But the audience needs a good performance to engage with so that they care, no matter how wacky the rest of the film is. This is a major flaw of the original Jesus Christ Superstar film. When I listened to the soundtrack, I was swept away by the emotion of the characters. However, I soon discovered when I rewatched the film that this emotion didn't translate into Ted Neely's face. This is a real shame because the main appeal of the rock opera is the fact that it portrays those black and white biblical icons into emotionally complex characters. It's why the character of Judas stood out so much more in my memory than Jesus himself. Despite being a great singer, Ted Neely's acting is probably the weakest part of the film. In terms of good performers, Diane Steinberg is a real diamond in the rough here. She hasn't done much else, and I imagine that, like Sandy Farina, this was supposed to be her big break. Which is a shame because I really enjoyed her performance. Probably my favourite scene is You Never Give Me Your Money, which she sings with Paul Nicholas, because it's the only scene in the film that is competently acted and sung. Also, Donald Pleasance is so different in everything I've seen him in that it just proves what an amazing character actor he was. However, neither of them can carry the film when none of the leads can act. Sgt Pepper had 4 times the budget of Tommy, but you wouldn't know from looking at it. This probably went to the stars involved, but regardless, the production design looks so bland in comparison. Whilst there are some creative decisions in Tommy that I still don't understand, namely why the rock star Sally Simpson marries as Frankenstein, there is so much that you can read into the production design if you choose to. If you're not interested in that, you can still marvel at the bold and outrageous spectacle. Jesus Christ Superstar went in the opposite direction. Apart from a few wackier costumes for the corrupt characters like Caiaphas and traditional white robes for Jesus, most of the costumes are contemporary clothes, tying in with the theatrical reenactment premise from the opening of the film. The film has little to no set, instead relying on the magnificent and bleak Israeli desert to create a timeless sense of atmosphere, whilst Tommy's vibrant design asks the viewer to think about the themes. Jesus Christ Superstar's minimalist production instead asks you to focus on the songs, the characters, and the story. In Sgt Pepper, it feels like the production designers couldn't decide whether to be outrageous or not. I think a more experienced director with a clear vision like Ken Russell could have given the creative team license to go totally insane. Director Michael Schultz had mostly made low-budget dramas and comedies at that time, including Car Wash, which I highly recommend. Although the allocation of budget to their stars was almost certainly out of Schultz's control, maybe he was too used to more naturalistic filmmaking to go all out on the wacky style. So, why did this movie fail to replicate the success of Stigwood's other weird and wonderful rock operas? Simple. They prioritise star power and clout over all artistic merit. Whilst there are a few good songs and performances, nothing can carry this film. It fails on every level, from story to the acting to the design, and sometimes even the music. This is proof that a film cannot survive on clout alone. When I first read about Across the Universe as a teenage Beatles fan, I sneered at it. It sounded so corporate and cheesy that I was thoroughly expecting not to like this movie, but it brought me to tears by the end. Which begs the question, why did this film succeed where the Sgt Pepper movie failed? Julie Taymor had been directing theatre since the 70s, but she reached international acclaim with her theatrical adaptation of The Lion King, which won 5 Tonys and 2 Oliviers, and with her second feature film, Frida, which won 2 Oscars. The latter was praised for its unusual style, that replicated the artistic style of its subject matter. I think that the success of Moulin Rouge certainly contributed to the creation of this film. Both Moulin Rouge and Across the Universe are romantic jukebox musicals that follow a young male British artist, who moves abroad to discover himself, before he gets taken in by a ragtag group of revolutionary artistes, who are part of the countercultural artistic movement of their respective historical settings. Both open with an ambiguous prologue of the protagonist singing about his lost love, before flashing back to the beginning of the story. Both involve trippy sequences of drug use. Both are in an overly theatrical style that assists in the suspension of disbelief necessary for a movie musical. Whilst I don't necessarily think that Julie Taymor, the writers, purposefully created the story with this in mind, I imagine it's probably what coaxed producers into making the film. After all, despite not being a consideration during production, Moulin Rouge ended up receiving 8 Oscar nominations, including Best Picture, and 1 for both production design and costume design. It was followed by other Oscar-winning musicals like Chicago. Therefore, an artsy jukebox musical helmed by the Tony's only female Best Director winner must have sounded like Oscar bait heaven in 2007. However, unlike the Sgt Pepper movie, this historical context doesn't feel like the only reason this film was created. Much like Sgt Pepper, Across the Universe did have an unconventional choice of writers, but they couldn't be more different from music critic Henry Edwards. This film was actually written by Dick Clement and Ian La Frenais, the writing duo best known for their long-running British sitcoms such as Porridge, but who had also been writing screenplays since, well, the year the movie is set. Predictably, they also had a track record of comedy when it came to film, but they also branched out into dramedy, and even wrote the infamous unofficial Bond film Never Say Never Again. Overall, they're an unconventional choice for an artsy musical, which may explain some of the issues with the script, but they are writing about their own generation and really capture the Beatles' own sense of humour. And, most importantly, the film is written by writers. The film follows Jude, a young Liverpudlian dock worker, who leaves behind his mum to find his father in the United States. After a cold and uncomfortable meeting with his dad at Princeton University, he befriends a rebellious young student called Max. Jude instantly becomes smitten by Max's sister Lucy, an innocent but progressive high schooler waiting for her sweetheart to return from Vietnam. But before he can take action, Max announces that he's dropping out of uni and moving to Greenwich Village in New York, taking Jude with him. They move in with a rock singer called Sadie, after his brother is killed in the Detroit race riots. An experimental young guitarist called Jojo comes to New York and joins Sadie's band. The gang are rounded out by Prudence, a young closeted lesbian escaping an abusive boyfriend who develops an unrequited love for Sadie. After Lucy's boyfriend is killed in Vietnam, she moves in with the gang, and Jude dumps his Greenwich Village girlfriend for her. Max gets drafted, but the guys have one last hurrah at a hippie commune where Prudence has found a girlfriend. After Max leaves, things start to fall apart. Sadie leaves Jojo, whilst Jude suspects that the leader of the revolutionaries Lucy has been campaigning with is just trying to sleep with her, causing a rift in their relationship. After trying to protect her at a protest, Jude is arrested and deported as an illegal immigrant. Whilst he is back in Liverpool, he sees that Lucy's revolutionary friends blow themselves up in their old flat, leaving him to believe that she was killed too. Max returns from war traumatised and morphine addicted, but writes to Jude telling him to come back and get Lucy at the launch of Sadie and Jojo's new record on the rooftop of their studio. Now, you may have noticed that I spent a little longer telling the story than I did with Sgt Pepper. But that's just because Sgt Pepper is so all over the place that it has plenty of scenes that have no impact on the plot whatsoever. Whilst it's certainly not an ensemble story, the film, for the most part, handles its 4 storylines surprisingly well. Essentially, it's the story of a generation, so multiple storylines make sense. My 2 issues with the story were that there are 3 songs back to back that seem to have very little impact on plot and character development, and we see very little of Prudence after she meets her girlfriend. Obviously, her arc is now complete, but it would be nice if she was in the film a bit more before the end, to reinforce the theme of love overcoming obstacles or something. Besides, it's not so satisfying to have this conflict resolved off screen. I would have preferred a song about these 2 rather than Mr. Kite. We didn't have time for 3 songs about the characters going on a trippy experience. 2 songs are more than enough when the only impact any of them have on the plot is 1 line of dialogue in between telling us that the storyline that had such emotional resonance at the beginning of the film has been resolved off screen. Maybe it's something to do with when this came out. I imagine it was far more risque to show a happy lesbian relationship than a lesbian's unrequited love in 2007. We don't even see Rita at the end of the movie with Prudence in the band. Another weakness of the script is the fact that there are characters who don't appear elsewhere in the movie that the characters are talking to. Sure, I'm certain that their friend group is extended to more than just 6 people, but I think it would be nice if that meant we got more dialogue from characters that needed more screen time anyway. As for the dialogue, it seems pretty believable, but it's pretty hard to compare to Sgt Pepper in terms of quality, as it had no dialogue aside from narration. However, it adds the necessary context to the songs, especially in this more grounded setting. Across the Universe definitely feels like they cherry-picked appropriate songs from the Beatles' entire back catalogue to fit the story, rather than getting the rights to most of the songs from the Beatles' 2 most successful albums and writing a story around that. It mostly feels like they wrote a story that just happened to fit the Beatles' songs, which is what a jukebox musical should sound like. It's not afraid to use lesser-known early songs, such as I've Just Seen a Face and Hold Me Tight, which suit the story. It also uses later Beatles songs later in the movie, as the setting mirrors the later events in the 60s, and the characters' alluded drug use mirrors the drug use of the Beatles themselves. First of all, there are songs with meanings that don't deviate too far from the original meaning of the song. This is much easier with songs from earlier in the Beatles' career, as many were written as love songs to appease their young female audience. These include Hold Me Tight, All My Loving, I've Just Seen a Face, and It Won't Be Long. Lucy's a feminist with rebellious ideas from the beginning, but she still has an innocent girl next door quality until that innocence is shattered by Daniel's untimely death. So it seems appropriate that these songs are sung by or about her, Come Together uses the song's lyrics to describe JoJo, whilst the visuals establish New York itself, juxtaposing the straight-laced businessmen of the financial district with the expressive community of Greenwich Village. When I brought up that there is a closeted gay character in this movie, I'm sure many Beatles fans will assume that this film features You've Got to Hide Your Love Away, a song that many suspect Lennon and McCartney wrote about their manager Brian Epstein, a closeted gay man who sadly died shortly before homosexuality was legalised. However, they chose instead to take I Want to Hold Your Hand, an innocent plea to a sweetheart for some mild affection, and turns it into a heartbreaking song about unrequited love. And it works! If I Fell is originally about asking your new lover not to break your heart like your ex did, but Lucy splits the character of the ex into two, referring to her own past romance, and referring to the girl that Jude dumps for her. She's the last character to sing a song from before 1967, which makes sense. She's the most innocent from a very traditional conservative area, so it makes sense that she sings a song with more innocent lyrics. Across the Universe avoided songs that narrated stories themselves, such as She's Leaving Home or Maxwell's Silver Hammer. Instead, they are songs in which the characters express their feelings, which is a better thing to spend our time on and doesn't have the issue of why someone is narrating something. They also don't overstay their welcome. Whilst the full versions are available on the soundtrack, some of them are over in a minute and a half in the film itself, especially at the beginning. Whilst it has roughly the same amount of songs, Sgt Pepper feels like it weighs down the film with pointless songs and pointless scenes. Even the ones that did make sense in the narrative go on for too long. Unless the song is showing off exposition or an interesting dance number, Across the Universe keeps it to just a couple of verses. Something I actually forgot to mention in my Sgt Pepper video is the 4 tracks sung by characters as performances. They offered nothing about the characters. This is especially a waste when you consider that Oh Darling, the emotionally potent song Paul wrote when John suggested breaking up the band, is just sung diegetically with no relation to how the characters are feeling. Across the Universe also includes 4 diegetic tracks, but these are also used to tell us something about those singing them. We first see Sadie perform Why Don't We Do It in the Road, which reinforces the sexual energy that we've been getting off her so far. We also get plenty of dialogue in this brief scene, so it doesn't take up too much time. The next song we see her perform is Oh Darling. This scene starts out as a performance. However, JoJo has already overheard Sadie's manager planning to get rid of him, and starts to make it a duet to rub her the wrong way and point out the irony of the lyrics. Sadie's performance of Helter Skelter plays over Lucy and Jude's arrests. This is where everything finally falls apart for Jude and Lucy. It's the least related to the story, but it's a good soundtrack for the panic and chaos of the scene. Finally, we see Sadie and JoJo singing Don't Let Me Down on the roof of their studio. This time, it is very much a planned duet, where they sing in harmony. This is not only the characters performing, it is a couple promising not to make the same mistakes. Oh, and I also forgot to mention A Day in the Life in Sgt Pepper, because it was completely bloody pointless. Unlike George Martin's work on the Sgt Pepper soundtrack, Elliot Goldenthal and the guest artists aren't afraid to do something more experimental with the Beatles' repertoire. The more sombre arrangements of I Want to Hold Your Hand and If I Fell suit the new interpretation, whilst While My Guitar Gently Weeps does feature electric guitar, its introduction is more reminiscent of the sombre and reflexive tone of George's original acoustic demo. I Want You has some militaristic drums and is sung by a male chorus of soldiers during Max's recruitment, before moving to something slower that reflects the longing and lust of the lyrics, as they apply to different characters, singing about different emotions. The 2 songs that stand out the most are I Want to Hold Your Hand because of how different the emotion is, and for the benefit of Mr. Kite because it doesn't really work, but I'll focus on this later. I think the alt-rock band Secret Machines, who worked on I Am the Walrus and whose covers of Flying and Blue Jay Way can also be found on the soundtrack, are really interesting. Their sound is almost as ambitious as the Beatles themselves during that period. I mean, Bowie was a big fan of them, which tells you all you need to know, really. The core cast is mostly made up of a combination of actors who can sing and singers who can act. There are no real weak links out of the 6 of them, although I am pretty sure that this film failed because Jim Sturgis upset an ancient burial ground or something, because he seems to be cursed to only be in films that are either critically panned or financial failures. Anyway, there are no barriers of acting ability to distance us from feeling for the characters, nor do they lack singing voices that distract us from the music. They have a variety of vocal styles that suit the personality of the characters, such as Sexy Sadie's raunchy rock vocals and Clean Cut Lucy's musical theatre style voice. None of them were big stars. Evan Rachel Wood was an established dramatic child actress and had already had a Golden Globe nomination at the age of 16. But she was still, by no means, a box office draw. Wood's performance is a standout one for me, as we see her mature from an innocent teenager to an angry and desperate activist. Unlike Sgt Pepper's bloated celebrity appearances, Across the Universe has only 3 songs by celebrity guest stars. Come Together is essentially a chorus number, but with Joe Cocker taking up the members of the chorus, as a homeless man, a pimp, and a hippie. This is a fantastic choice, as Cocker was best known for his cover of With a Little Help from My Friends. The film even uses a similar arrangement for the end of their version of the song. Next there's Bono as a Timothy Leary-style figure Dr. Robert, singing I Am the Walrus, as well as the cover of Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds during the end credits. Bono is neither particularly good or bad, he's just fine. I think the weakest musical number of the film is Eddie Izzard's performance of For the Benefit of Mr. Kite. Whilst Izzard is a great comedian and they certainly do their best here, I think that Eddie's improv comes off as irritating rather than witty. There's a special feature where you see an unused take and it's very clearly improvised. Spoken word covers are also hard to pull off. Whilst George Martin produced a cover that was completely spoken with Billy Connolly, it works much better with its immersive sound design and steam organ. That version wasn't really a song at all, it was more of a poem. You can't just Rex Harrison it. Unless of course you are Rex Harrison. On the whole, the film relied on casting suitable actors rather than big stars for the lead roles, and it paid off. This means that we can emotionally engage with the characters even when they aren't singing fantastic songs, instead of having to put up with the blank stares of Peter Frampton and the Bee Gees for 2 hours. What celebrity guests we do get are mostly fine, but it's only really Joe Cocker that makes a big impact in my opinion. Unlike the Sgt Pepper movie, it makes sense for most of them to be there, and I don't feel like the entire story has been written around including as many cameos as possible. Taymor's theatrical sensibilities work well here. Modern movie musicals generally have to work with establishing the suspension of disbelief. We're so used to a single naturalistic style in cinema that movie musicals now tend to either establish that all of the songs are dream sequences, or the whole film is made in a theatrical artistic style that suspends disbelief throughout. This is why it works so well for animation, as the audience always had to suspend their disbelief whilst watching drawings talk. While Sgt Pepper either didn't have the commitment or budget to pull off the minimalist or overly symbolic style of either of Stigwood's previous rock opera movies, Taymor isn't afraid to use artistic flourishes, especially when the characters start using LSD. In fact, it's something about the Mr. Kite scene that I actually like. The use of puppetry, masks and animation work well in this scene, as do the masks in the anti-Vietnam protest. This is in stark contrast to Sgt Pepper, which never committed to a more bizarre aesthetic, making its fantastical story feel out of place. Whilst the plot of Across the Universe is grounded in reality, this only makes the fantastical imagery more interesting and exciting. Although there may have been a trend that contributed to the creation of this film, it doesn't prioritise clout over quality. It's by no means a perfect movie, as critics were very split on this one, but there is really no argument over whether or not it's a better film than the Sgt Pepper movie. But do you know what the sad thing is about all of this? Sgt Pepper was financially successful, whilst Across the Universe bombed. Whilst there are almost certainly other factors, at the end of the day, the stunt casting worked in Sgt Pepper's favour. Hollywood still knows that the cast list is often the main reason tickets are sold, although publicly smearing Taymor for insisting on her cut of the film probably didn't do the studio any favours. Would I recommend Across the Universe? Absolutely. Is it for everyone? Of course not. I know that plenty of people will find Julie Taymor's artistic flourishes too pretentious for their taste, and that's okay. But I think it's worth a try. If you aren't its audience, I'm sure you'll know someone who is. Musical Hell and Musicals with Cheese did a fantastic video explaining their two different opinions of this movie, so I would recommend watching that if you are still on the fence about whether or not this film is for you. Chances are, if you like musicals or arty movies or trippy movies or the 60s or the Beatles or dramatically different cover songs, then you'll probably get something out of it. I generally don't think the flaws I discussed here really hindered the enjoyment of the film. I actually had to cut this video down to just the points that were relevant to this comparison, rather than just gushing about everything I love about this film. Even when I thought I couldn't love the works of the Beatles more than I already did, some of these songs mean even more to me now as a result of the context in which this film uses them. I would also love to see a visually spectacular stage adaptation of this. After all, if they made a Tony-nominated Broadway adaptation of Xanadu, one of the two films that inspired the Razzies, then why not Across the Universe? What few issues there are with this film could easily be cleared up with a longer runtime, especially if they cut or trimmed down the drug trip sequence, and instead spent more time on storylines other than Lucy and Jude. With its large core cast, it would also be ideal for community theatre and high school productions, giving it a life long after its professional run.
Have you gone mad? No, Willie. We've gone into business.
Showtime!